there's a couple more coming along, but I think you're pretty good.
Okay, because we gotta be done by noon, right? Okay, so I'll make up for time. Hi everyone, I'm Patrick Schultz, not Greg. I'm standing in for Greg Edel, who usually kind of does this kind of or runs the maple syrup operation here at Pack Forest. I'm with Washington State University. I have my own maple syrup operation down in Olympia, so Greg asked me to stand in and give a quick talk. So we've got about 45 minutes, and there is a lot to talk about. Full-day workshops on maple sugaring. So I want to say up front, please feel free to interrupt me, ask questions, just interject, raise your hand. I want to make sure that you walk away with the stuff that you really want to know about. But other than that, we'll talk a little bit about kind of the background of maple sugaring, it being kind of a new thing for this region. We'll talk about collecting, tapping and collecting sap, processing, maybe dig into like the marketing part as well, and kind of what's going on at the commercial scale in Washington and Oregon, as well as some of the barriers. So getting started, like I said, background, we all probably know maple sugaring is not really synonymous with the Pacific Northwest, right? It's more of a Vermont thing or Midwest thing. So there's not a really long history of making maple syrup here. There is some evidence, speaking of indigenous uses of the land, there's some really minor evidence of indigenous communities or people using maple sap historically, but it's really pretty limited. I like to think they maybe had better sense than to mess around with it. I'll understand why I say that into the processing. But people that have been doing this at the hobby scale for 20 to 30 years. So it is totally possible. That is the first questions people ask. Is this even possible? Yes, it's 100% possible. And even lucrative to make maple syrup. And part of that is due to technological advances that make it easier to go from sap all the way to syrup. So a little more background. In the University of Washington got a incredible grant to do some research on this. And they enlisted a bunch of study sites to look at what kind of sap production they expect out of bigleaf maples. Is this commercially viable? Essentially, to ask that question. That's how I got involved. I was one of those sites in Olympia, and then we got another grant shortly, maybe a year or two after that, to do a lot of outreach and education. And that's actually ending on Monday. That grant is ending on Monday. Yeah, and I just got another. So that's real. So keeping this work going, and it's really exciting. So I don't want to stop right here. I would like to go over where there's a little bit more demonstration equipment, a little more stuff to look at. They actually have some lines up in the woods there, but the path isn't really well maintained, and I don't want to assume that everyone's wearing the right footwear to get up there and wants to go through the blackberry with me. So if we can, unless there's any questions just on that in the background. Seeing none, we'll just go over behind the sugar shack here, and we'll end up back out front. Will someone, actually, I'll grab it real quick. The material. We good, Jen? Okay, here. All right, so someone's got to keep me on time because I will talk our way through lunch. Kind of starting with the physiology behind sap, why tap maples and not other trees? How is leaf maple different than sugar maple or some of the maples they tap on the East Coast? For all species, for all trees in the Acer genus, which is maple, produce a particularly sweet sap. So in the case of sugar maple, name, it has the highest sugar content at to even up to 4% sugar. Big leaf maple is much lower. It's about 1.5% sugar, averaging somewhere in between there. So that's kind of one of the changes, one of the reasons there was not a really, a pre-existing commercial industry here, is that you need twice as much sap to make as the same amount of syrup as they do with the sugar maple, which also means you're using a lot of energy to burn off all of that water and reduce down to syrup. Fortunately, there's something reverse osmosis, which we'll talk about during processing, that really levels the playing field for us. But for now, you're just gonna have to trust me that this is viable. So what happens in maples, and this is true for all maples, not big leaf, it's a response to changing temperatures. So in the winter here in the East Coast, it's in the spring, when we get temperatures at night that are going down below freezing, what's happening is active space, and this is what's kind of unique about maples, in the intercellular spaces between like the xylem and all of that. Won't get into the real physiology of it. I don't want to disappoint any amateur physiologists here. But essentially what happens is that gas freezes, and as we know, when gas freezes, that creates a vacuum that pulls water from the soil during the winter when the tree is dormant. And so that water from the soil is going up into the stem, even up high into the canopy, and in the process, it's dissolving sugars that are also stored in those intercellular spaces, as well as nutrients, minerals, and stuff like that. That's when it takes on that 1 to 1.5% sugar content. So when we form a day after that, that sap starts to melt and come down on the tree, and then we can collect it by drilling a hole in the tree, and basically the higher relative pressure inside the tree compared to outside allows that sap to come out. So that's how you can collect it with a bucket and a bag or tubing. We'll get into those different ways to collect it. So that's really important, though, is that timing. It's all about the temperatures. So here in Washington, we can get freezing temperatures anytime between November and even into early March. But you also want to pair that with really good precipitation. There's a lot of aligning conditions that make for a really great sap flow. I always say that the ideal situation is lots of rain that turns into snow, and then we get one of those long stretches where we're below freezing for 2 or 3 days, and then it's in the 50s. And that actually happens more often than you think. That happened last year, I want to say just after the holidays or just before, and I had just a gangbuster of a sap flow. I mean, it's just fantastic when that really happens. But you get also several smaller flows in between that. So we have a longer sap season compared to the eastern United States, where they're kind of waiting for mid-March into April. They have maybe 2 to 4 weeks at the most. We have about 3 months where we could get sap at any time, and you're kind of watching the weather in that whole time. So one thing I say about maple sugaring is that it's, in the span of that whole season, it's not that much work, but it's a lot of work now. So you got to drop everything when the weather's right, and then that's what you're doing for a little while. So keep that in mind, especially for a commercial operation. But even at the hobbyist scale, you might be taking a day off work to be feeding the fire and making some syrup. Any questions about how trees produce sap, and how I'll get into how we collect it, but kind of the physiology of that.
Are you taking something away that the tree needs?
This is a great question. Yes. So technically, well, needs is a strong word. Technically, yes, we are taking resources from the tree. But they've done some pretty significant longitudinal studies in sugar maple. We haven't done that with big leaf maple yet. And they found that between tapped trees and untapped trees, there's really minimal difference in growth and health. In fact, they saw less than a 5% reduction in growth, which is pretty indicative of health. So you're really not, and it speaks to a larger question, is we don't really know what the benefit, the evolutionary mechanism of sap flow is and how it benefits maples. That's not really well understood why they do this, why other trees don't. But we are drawing resources from it, but I compare it to drawing blood. As long as you don't take too much, you're going to be fine. So,
is the rate of flow affected by the size of the tree?
Yes.
Repeat the question.
Oh, that's a good point. Yeah. So the question is the rate of flow affected by the size of the tree? And yes, that was one of the things that came out of the UW study, which is that bigger tends to be better. So they only went to about 24 inches in diameter, though. And I've noted, and some other hobbyists have noted, that the really big old growth monsters don't actually tend to produce that well. And there's, different perspectives on that. Everybody has different experiences, but that seems to be a trend I've noticed. And I think, what's that? Yeah, so Dave has a theory that the sapsuckers follow the sapsuckers, which is it's not a bad inclination, right? We haven't tested it, but I think it's good.
Something I've anecdotally noticed as well is look at the crown of the tree more than the diameter of the tree. If you have a whole lot of live, healthy branches, that's a lot more potential.
Yes.
Really what I've seen versus, again, some of those bigger old, the old mother kind of maples, they're getting a little sparse at this point of their life.
I think that's a good point too, and it speaks to the health of the tree. A healthy tree is going to produce a little more sap than something that's unhealthy, which this segues really nicely into the next part, which is what trees do you want to tap? And there is a lower size limit. So if we were to follow the traditional sugar maple rules, we would say we'd never tap anything less than 10 inches. 10 to 20 inches can get 1 tap. 20 to 25 can get 2 taps, and above 25 it can get 3 taps, but you never put more than 3 taps, something like that. So bigleaf maple, we all know, is a little bit of a weed. It's really hard to kill, frankly. So we are kind of thinking we can push that a little further in the other direction. Sugar maple, if anybody has experience with that, is actually kind of a sensitive tree. And it's really slow growing. It's just not nearly as vigorous as our bigleaf maple. So the things that make it the tree that timber growers hate the most are the things that make it a great tree for tapping. Vigorous growth. It also creates multiple stems. You can tap any stem over that certain size limit, which I like to say is probably still 6 to 8 inches. I don't think you'd want to tap anything less. The exception being is if you have a tree, this only has 3 stems, but I'm sure people have maples that have 14, 20, even 30 stems. What you could do is tap one and then alternate until those stems get bigger. Because the real reason that we don't want to put a lot of taps on is the sustainability of being able to tap that tree over time, which I'll get into. Another method with the clump trees or the multi-stemmed trees is to tap the losers. The trees that you're pretty sure are not going to, if a tree has 30 stems, in 20 years, there's only going to be 10 or maybe less, right? That clump is going to thin itself out. So pick the losers and you can tap those as much as you want. It sounds a little brutal, but that's nature. So those are kind of methods and opportunities that we have here with bigleaf maple that you really don't often have with sugar maple. Go ahead.
I think soil matters, drainage.
Yeah, so I absolutely do. I mean, it matters for the health of the maple. They like wet soils that are pretty adequately drained. They don't like to sit with their feet in the water. So again, and a healthy maple is going to produce more sap. So from that perspective, yes. But we've also noticed that, just again, anecdotally, people tend to say that trees next to a water source, so in some of those riparian soils, the stream banks, tend to produce a lot more sap as well. I had a program going for a little while called the Sapsuckers, which was like a hobbyist. It unfortunately didn't get enough participation to warrant keep continuing it, but it was really good for collecting that individual tree data and understanding what makes trees produce more. Because once we get into these tubing systems, then you can no longer really figure out what individual trees are doing. It's all going into one tank, and you're just kind of looking at it as an aggregate.
Related to soil, just site in general, would you talk about like the topography or the exposure, for instance, aspect?
Yeah, those are all really good questions. So, I mean, aspect is a really funny one because they say, south can be better because that's going to warm more after a freeze. And so those are going to be your trees that start first. But a north aspect might be more likely to freeze. So you kind of have to weigh those. And ultimately, I think it's a wash. Your north aspect trees may take a little longer to thaw, but they might freeze more, and vice versa. So I'm not certain that aspect has a really strong influence over an overall production. Topography is more from a perspective of practicality. You want some topography. Obviously, 40% slopes are not fun to work on, but something that gives you between 10 and 20 or more than 5 is really ideal for these gravity systems. So when you get into tubing and you move away from buckets and bags collecting on individual trees, which you don't need gravity or topography for that at all. But when you get into these, you really want, at minimum, a 3% slope 5% to make sure that it really flows adequately and you don't get sap kind of pooling and it gets really gross, especially with one of the things we deal with here is mild temperatures during the day throughout the whole winter, which leads to a lot of bacterial growth. And we're not worried about bacterial growth from a food safety perspective because we're boiling, but it does change the flavor of the syrup. And you can taste syrup that maybe sat too long versus syrup that's was, boiled really quickly and stuff like that. So topography is important from that perspective, but not necessarily going to improve individual tree sap production. So that segues nicely into collection systems. I've already kind of alluded to it. Let me check my time too. Yeah. So there is the traditional buckets and bags. That's how everyone gets started, right? You can either buy some buckets that hang off of a tap on the tree. What I like to do is use some of this, buy just a little bit of this tubing. So this tubing is kind of what makes the maple syrup industry lucrative at this point, because you're not hauling individual buckets and collecting them in a tank. And that's just a lot of work. It's fine for, 10 to 20 taps, but at scale, that's just really, really difficult. So this tubing is really dirt cheap. It is reusable if you maintain it and clean it. What I would say for beginners is that they can buy some of this tubing or come to me. I've got a lot of it. I'm going to be putting together some more tapping kits soon for sale, and put a tap on one end and then just lead it into a bucket on the ground. Those Lowe's buckets, those are food safe actually, or the TSC buckets. And that whole thing is going to be like I don't know, maybe a $6 tap versus like you buy the tapping kits, those cost like $50 and you'll get like 4 of them. Not trying to take away from our sugaring suppliers, but those are much, twice the cost per tap versus just getting some tubing and running it to a bucket on the ground. You can even run it from multiple trees into the same bucket at that point to use a little bit of tubing. Another benefit of the tubing is, first there's 2 sizes. This right here is 3/16 inch. That's the diameter of the tubing. This is 5/16 inch. Inside, yes. There is a lot of debate over which is better. And I don't really know where I stand. I think it's situational. But one of the real big benefits of 3/16 is that it's small enough diameter that you can get natural vacuum. So as the sap pulls and it fills the full column, with gravity, you have to have gravity for this. So as the sap's coming out, it's coming down the tube and it's pulling additional sap from the tree. So there's some research that says, with a drop of like 20 to 30 feet, you can get 20-30% more sap using this stuff than if you were to use the bigger diameter stuff, where it's really harder to fill that entire column. So that's the benefit. They call it gravity tubing as well. So that would be really good for a hobbyist that doesn't want to buy artificial vacuum, which we'll talk about as well. And potentially, it's also really good for commercial producers that are out in the middle of nowhere and they don't have, electricity to buy, to set up artificial vacuum. If you're using artificial vacuum, you want to use the 5/16, generally speaking. So, all right. So that's basically the 2 options in terms of collection, as buckets and bags, individual trees, and then tubing systems. And so what you see here is the beginning of what's called, these are generally called a lateral line. And a drop line drops off of it. And this is not, there you go. So a drop line will drop off of it with one of these T's spliced into it like this, connects to the tree, and that drops into a lateral line. And then that will flow into a main line, which is what that bigger tubing is. So this is more of a commercial operation. And that's what they're doing here at University of Washington. They're eventually going to be selling their syrup if they're not already. I'm not really sure about that. They have it labeled for sale at least. So when you get into getting a main line, the reason for that is usually so that you can apply artificial vacuum, which I've teased enough that I should probably just talk about it. And it's exactly what it sounds like. It's using a vacuum pump to draw sap out of the trees, and that will double your sap flow in many cases or more. I mean, it really maximizes production. And there's two grades of vacuum: low vacuum and high vacuum. Low vacuum, so at my demonstration site, I have low vacuum. And that's mostly just because I have about a half a mile of main line, and about half of that is almost level. So it's really difficult to get that grade. And that's just to help me get the sap back to a tank. So it does help with production, but it's not really meant for that.
Will an artificial vacuum potentially initiate a flow that wouldn't otherwise happen or lengthen a flow that's happening?
I didn't pay him to do this. Yeah, I'll repeat the question. Sorry, I've been really bad about that. So the question is, will artificial flow lengthen a sap flow or start a sap flow that didn't exist? It is a little bit harder to start a sap flow, but with really high power vacuum, that is possible. And that is something they're experimenting with both here and in the Northeast, largely worrying about climate change and whether or not we're going to get sufficient freezes for sap flow. So with high power vacuum, you can pull sap right out of the trees without a freeze. It tends to be lower sugar content though. Not necessarily half, but somewhere around 75% of the sugar. So you have to keep that in mind. But I was talking with people at the Cornell program, and they were sucking sap out of the trees in October. The tree does still have to be dormant, and they were getting as much or more sap as they were in March, which is pretty wild to think about. So that's high power vacuum. Some people worry you're going to give a tree like an aneurysm. And that hasn't happened yet. You know, the wood is strong. It's not going to collapse the fibers or anything like that. But, you know, that's also why we have these sustainable tapping guidelines and we don't have 100 taps on one tree. I forgot to mention, and this is the whole reason that I bring this around, and I'll pass this around. So one of the things that's happening when you're tapping, I gotta check my time again. You're creating what we call non-conductive wood or scar tissue, right? So trees, you may have heard the phrase, people heal, trees seal. So when we get hurt, we just kind of regrow that part for the most part, right? Not all things. But when a tree gets hurt, it just seals off that area and doesn't use it anymore. And that's what's happening here. If you can see, it's starting to fade quite a bit. This is a tapping scar. So this is an old tap hole. And this is the scar that gets created. And this will never create, this is non-conductive wood now. It will never be able to produce sap again. It's just totally quartered off just to avoid any sort of disease getting into the tree. And so it tends to be about 10 to 12 inches down, 10 to 12 inches up, and about an inch, sometimes as much as 2 inches wide. So when we're actually doing, when we're trying to create a sustainable tapping method for going back to the same tree again, we want to make sure we're avoiding the scar wood. So what we do is we go 10 to 12 inches down, 1 to 2 inches over, and then 10 to 12 inches up, 1 to 2 inches over. And you keep going all the way around the tree, and you might tap, you know, twice, because in a season, because we have longer seasons, and the tap only remains viable for about 6 weeks. But generally you're probably not tapping more than twice. So with tapping maybe twice per year, by the time you get back to this area, you would ideally have about 2 inches of fresh sapwood to tap into.
You seal the holes.
No, we don't. The question is, do we seal the tap holes afterwards? So trees are really good at doing this themselves. And in fact, some studies show that a lot of those tree sealants actually hinder healing. So we don't really recommend those.
How far does that stain? You say it's about 10 inches up and down. How far into the wood does that go?
It should go about 2 inches. You can't really see it here, but that's about how far you're drilling. Is about 2 inches in, 1.5 to 2 inches.
In terms of on down the road, if the tree is cut down and milled,
Yes.
what would that look like?
Yes. So the question is, what will it look like when you mill the wood? And it won't be very valuable, is the question, unless you market it specially, which is something they do in the East Coast. They market tapped wood, and it has the tapping scars on it. It'll even have gaps. You know, I've seen a coffee table where there's like little gaps in the table because, you know, and that's something that people enjoy. But from a larger perspective, no, the lumber is not going to be particularly valuable, but bigleaf maple is not particularly valuable lumber to begin with. So we're not doing too much damage there. I will pass this around, but it's neat to look at. Just looking to get a handle on that scar. Question?
We have an online question.
Oh, sure, yeah.
So they're asking, can the sap tubing be flushed with food grade alcohol, aka whiskey or 151, as needed to reduce the bacteria challenge?
So that is a really good question. Do I need to repeat the question again? Well, the question is about basically what products can you use to sanitize the tubing? And this is like, we could spend a day on this. And I've had a lot of personal crash courses myself with just disgusting lines that I've had to clean. Ultimately, bleach is the best thing to use. If you do it regularly, if you regularly flush tubing with water throughout the season, that'll reduce the amount of times you need to use bleach, and maybe just do it at the beginning of the season or the end, or like right before a really good sap flow if you really want to take advantage and make sure that sap is clean. But bleach is great because basically it just breaks down into salt and water. In fact, we actually use a calcium bleach. So it breaks down into calcium and water, and the squirrels don't chew up our lines for the salts. That is a big problem. A lot of people think that deer are going to be the ones that get into the tubing. It's not. It's the squirrels. They will ruin your day for sure. But so, yeah, I mean, tubing sanitation is a really difficult thing. What they do here is they have a pump, and I do the same thing at my system, and they pump from the bottom all the way up the lines. They pump a bleach solution or a water solution, and they go out and they pull all the taps, and then they just let it flush out, put it back in, and that's how they kind of sanitize it that way. Again, though, like, we're not worried at it from a food safety perspective, so you're never going to eliminate all bacteria like entirely, but it does affect the flavor, so you just kind of want to mitigate it as best you can. And what's happening there, by the way, is essentially it's yeast, not really bacteria, and the yeast is what is it doing? It's transforming sucrose into glucose and fructose, which comes out of the tree as sucrose, and glucose and fructose are more burnable. So they create these more caramely flavors, which are not necessarily bad, but if you let it go too long, if the sap spoils a little too much, it creates a very sour, sort of acrid flavor in the syrup. And you go too long and you get what's called ropey syrup, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's just kind of like a glob, which is really disgusting, but believe it or not, has a market. So, that's like grade E syrup or something like that. So, was there a question? I thought I saw someone raise their hand. Okay, well, I'll keep talking then. So we talked about collection, we talked about vacuum. One thing I did want to really drive home is the timing of tapping. And none of you can call me this winter and say, I tried this and it's your fault, because you're going to listen to this one point, which is don't go out on December 1st and tap a hole and put your tap in and wait for the sap. Remember that those taps are only viable for about 4 to 6 weeks. The trees are, even though they're dormant, are starting to heal immediately after you tap them. So what you want to do is wait for that good weather. In fact, I wait for the freeze. I don't even really trust the weather that it's going to freeze overnight and tap the day before. Usually I'm waiting and I've got a thermometer, an outdoor thermometer at home, and I see how cold did it get, and did it get cold for long enough. If it got down to 30 degrees for 2 hours, that's not really going to give you a sap flow. But if it got down to 30 degrees for 10 hours and you have like a pretty decent frost, that might give you a little sap flow, might be worth tapping. So you kind of have to weigh those a little bit. But generally, though, you want to wait until the freeze has happened, or you're absolutely certain that there's going to be a freeze, and then you go out and tap. And that will give you the best flow. And that's one of the things, too, with retapping in the same season. You kind of have to weigh the odds. If you had a really good sap flow and then it's 3 weeks later and the conditions are right for another really good sap flow, you might consider retapping, even though your existing hole could be viable still. And that's just, again, to take advantage of that fresh wood, that fresh sap wood. So you're always kind of playing that game of, should I retap or should I use my existing tap? That kind of thing. Any questions? And we can dig into the processing because we only have 15 minutes here.
With a lower sugar content here, higher or longer season, is it possible to basically come out with more syrup per year per tree?
We're not matching East Coast level production per tree yet. It's a really good question too, because you have to question. It's what they do is a gallon per tap is generally how they measure it, and that usually for them equates to gallon per tree. But for us, we can have a tree with, 10 taps. So from that perspective, maybe we are matching production, but it's kind of been, apples and oranges a little bit. But generally speaking, I'd say we're not really quite outpacing them yet. No, no.
Important distinction, and maybe the market has changed since I last heard it, but something that might perk your ears up at the feasibility of this is the anecdote I've heard, or the comparison I've heard, is a gallon of maple syrup wholesale East Coast is worth about $30. A gallon of Bigleaf maple syrup out here is worth about 300. So much lower volume.
500.
500.
Yeah. It's about $4. Well, and we have limited samples for this. In Washington, we have Neil's Bigleaf maple syrup, and he sells for $4 an ounce. In Oregon, they have several producers that are selling about the same level. And that is up to your point too. Like, this is, in today's point, this is a boutique product. We are not trying to replace the maple syrup on the grocery store shelves. We can't really compete from that perspective. We don't want to. We want to create a unique Pacific Northwest product. And when you taste it in a little while, you'll understand why we're doing that, because it does tend to have different applications. Personally, I'm not a big fan of it on pancakes. I like it caramelizing bacon and whiskey. Someone mentioned whiskey. It's great. Baking is really good for baking. I believe that people are probably going to think this is gross, but Spam. A lot of Korean recipes use Spam, and caramelizing Spam with Bigleaf maple, just try it before you judge it. It's so good. So there's lots of cool applications for that, and we're thinking about making like a cookbook for it too. So
the flavor I often get with it is like vanilla extract. So it's more of that kind of very low concentration. You don't need a lot.
Yeah.
Necessarily.
And one of the things we're really trying to push is sort of the regional, almost like make it like wine. Year to year, and this is something that every hobbyist will tell you, is the syrup tastes different this year, and it tastes different in Pacific County than it does up in Snohomish County. And so we gotta have that like terroir or whatever French kind of. And this is all just kind of build up the market for it. And some people may think it's hogwash, some people may believe it. I believe it, but it's fun. It's fun for the marketing perspective. So let's go over. We can't fit everyone in the Sugar Shack, unfortunately. So we'll kind of rotate through. But I'll talk for a little bit about reverse osmosis on the way in. Oh, does somebody got my stump?
I think what that would.
Okay, good. All right, cool. Thanks, Kel.
So the tap is into the wood. It's not just into the bark where the xylem and phloem would be.
No, yeah, I mean, you would think because phloem has more sugar content, that's what we're tapping, but no, we're actually tapping the xylem, the sapwood. Yep.
Okay.
Oh, where's John? Oh, there he is. Okay. So we'll kind of rotate through, give everybody a chance to look at the evaporator. I won't have a lot of time here to talk about the processing side of things. Happens to be my least favorite part of it anyway. I really like being out in the woods and collecting. I think if anyone tries this, you'll find that you like one part and maybe not so much the other part, but someone else really likes that part, so you should team up with them. So what they do here, obviously, you can see this big tank. What they're doing is they're collecting all the sap in the bigger tank on the bottom. And then what they do is they run it through this. This is a reverse osmosis machine. And some people may be familiar with the concept of reverse osmosis, which is just filtration. So what they're doing is they're pushing the sap through. And every time you push the sap through this, it doubles in sugar content. So it's taking out half of the water. So if you have 100 gallons of sap at 1% sugar, it's going to come out at 50 gallons at 2%. And then it's going to off-put purified water, which we call permeate, and we use to clean the reverse osmosis and other stuff. And that big black tank over there is where they store their permeate. So this machine is the same one as mine, I believe, and it will get up to 8% sugar. So if you think about that, if you take that 50 gallons, that's at 2%. Now you got 25 gallons at 4%, and then 12.5 gallons at 8%. You just removed almost 90% of your water without even putting it in an evaporator, burning even a single block of wood. You remove 90% of the water. This is the thing that levels the playing field for low percentage maple species. So this is allowing other people to try this as well. You know, in Utah, they're tapping big-tooth maple. Other parts of the world, they're tapping box elder, which is actually a maple species. Not everyone knows that. So it's not just here in the Pacific Northwest. A lot of people are starting to tap maples and create these really unique products. The big-tooth maple is truly a unique product. If you ever get a chance to taste it, it's very, very light. It's almost like bubble gum in a way. That's good, I swear. So it's just really cool to kind of see this happening kind of in all these different regions. But the reverse osmosis is quite an expensive machine. This one will cost about $5,000. So it is at this scale is certainly more for a commercial operation. At the hobbyist level, they do have smaller nano RO systems that might cost like, I think there's one available. The cheapest I've seen is like 300. And they go up to like 600 or 1,000, and they might get you up to like 2% or 4%, which is still a lot for the high. You know, I have cooked maple sap, big leaf maple sap, raw from 1% all the way to, you know, 68% is essentially what syrup is, and it takes all day. It takes all day of feeding the fire and more to get, you know, maybe a gallon or so, which is great because, you know, at the hobbyist level, you probably only need a gallon for your whole year. But and it can be a lot of fun too. I don't want to undersell that experience of like hanging out with people, throwing wood on the fire, mixing the partial syrup with some whiskey or whatever you choose. I mean, that's an experience, and it speaks to the agritourism opportunities around this as well. It's not just about selling sap or syrup or sap or other sugar products. You can also sell the experience, and I think the East Coast is a great example of that. I mean, they do that all the time, and I think we should be able to do that as well. So once it's through the RO, you go right into the evaporator, which you'll see in there. Here in a pack, they have a very nice evaporator, much nicer than mine. I'm very jealous of it. And it's actually gas-fired because right now in the state of Washington, there's a lot of debate over whether or not a wood-fired evaporator can be certified. There's some real hurdles, just to speak quickly to that, around regulation right now in maple syrup because it's just so new. And the regulators don't really know how to handle something like this. But if we look at examples across the country, it really, we can break some of these barriers, I think, pretty quickly. And Oregon is doing a really great job of that, and they have a lot of commercial producers coming online. But their evaporator is gas. But again, that's not as big of a deal because it's already coming in at 8% sugar. So there's really not that much water to burn off at that point. After you're done, the processing part is essentially a really hard boil where you bring it up to like from 8% after the RO up to like 40 to 50% sugar. And then you want to refine it up to 67% on a more refined heat, like a stove or something like that. One of the things as a hobbyist, don't cook this indoors. You may be tempted, but do not do at least the hard boil. Do not do that indoors. Do it outside over stove. It's a lot of steam. And there's even stories out east of like in these really old houses where all the steam has, you know, ceilings collapse essentially. But at the you know, least you'll probably have some black mold issues because you're literally pumping out gallons and gallons of steam. So do that hard boil outside if you're doing it at the hobby scale. They have you know, fans and blowers and all that to pump the steam out of the building. So but after the refined boil, you're bringing it, it's, you know, 67-68% sugar. I won't get into how you test that. If you have questions later, I could talk more, but you do have to filter it as well. And not everyone knows that, but there's something called sugar sands that get created in the boiling process, and it's edible, but it's a little bitter. And if you were to have just raw maple syrup, it'd be incredibly cloudy. And I don't know, they might have some examples of that in the fridge in there. I'll see if I can show you. But those sugar sands actually can be used as a byproduct as well, because I'm going to talk about whiskey too much, but it works really well. Is you run whiskey through the sugar sands, and it essentially it takes all that syrup that's locked in those sands, and it you know, it blends into the whiskey in a really great and dangerous way. And then you can use the sands for like fertilizer because it's just minerals. It's just like iron and other minerals that bind to the sugars during the boiling process.
That's whiskey healthy.
Yes, exactly. And your sugar healthy. Yeah.
How long does this process work?
So this is a high power machine that can move about 180 gallons per hour, process 180 gallons per hour, because this is a high power pump. Some of those nano hobbyists, they move a lot slower. So you have to keep that in mind. But this thing is set up to be able to process sap pretty quickly.
And you always do it in batches?
What I do personally is I wait until I have about 200 gallons to process, and then I do it, or I process once a day, essentially, is what it comes down to. So I have about 200 taps in my demonstration site. And in a really good sap flow, I might get 800 gallons in a day. But otherwise, I might get 200 gallons, I might get 100 gallons. So it kind of depends on what stage of the sap run you're in. But because the sap sitting there is going to collect, foster bacteria and stuff, I really try to process it once a day. And so I guess in that sense, it is batches. But once I reduce it down, I'm putting it in the evaporator too, to essentially flash boil it. And then I can kind of process syrup over. That buys me some time essentially to process the syrup. You can also reduce it and then freeze it. And at a hobby scale, if you're only dealing with a few gallons, that works really well. And then boil it all at the end of the season. And I've heard of some people doing that as well. So let's kind of work our way through the Sugar Shack. At what time? Okay.
Soon, but it'll be there.
Yeah, well, we can do this as like a slow fade out. Work in if you want to see the evaporator and taste some maple syrup, and then head over to lunch. And I'll just be sitting in here talking a bit. So here's the maple syrup if anyone wants to try. Spoons. Oof. Good. Yeah, let's use this one. Some of the syrup, So one thing, if you look at this, what's happening here is the sugar has crystallized, or the syrup has crystallized. And that means that you went a little too high. You probably went up towards 69% sugar or something like that. And that forces the syrup to sort of crystallize and turn into sugar a little bit. So nothing against UW, but I am told that this batch is not their finest work. So keep that in mind. But any syrup is good syrup, in my opinion.
I made the brains and the mining things last year.
Oh, yeah.
Really taste not pronounced.
You pretty happy with it? Or?
I like the first year better.
Yeah.
This year this last year, it's much darker.
Everyone said the same thing last year. It said it's much darker.
And the flavors are more, to me anyway, it's more molasses. The first batch was more like caramel, butterscotch. Yeah.
I love that. Cool. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, and I actually had a couple of people that I didn't taste to with this last winter's tasted coffee.
Yeah.
Notes.
I've had some that taste pretty coffee forward. One of the things everyone said last year too was an immense amount of sugar sands.
Oh,
lots of sugar. I don't know if that was your experience, but I had so many. I have gallon Ziploc bags full of sugar sands. I don't know what to do with because I don't want to throw them away.
I filtered this year. And
Yeah.
I did.
Oh yeah, and then you could just pour it off. Yeah, that's it.
Because I didn't have. I think I had 8 for like 16 ounces. That's all I had.
And those filters will capture. They'll take a lot of syrup from it. Yeah.
Yeah. I didn't want to.
Yeah.
So the other thing I did was what you were talking about there at the end, I collected, and I actually would take it and put it in the refrigerator.
Yeah.
I got a small refrigerator until I had like 4 or 5 gallons, and then I would cook it down to about 15% and freeze it.
Oh yeah.
And
Yeah.
then and then I didn't cook it all the way to 60, whatever.
Right.
Until the end.
I think that's a great way to do it because if you can get it down to 15%, I mean that's very little. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
The only thing I put it in Ziploc freezer. Can I sneak behind?
Oh, of course. Yeah.
I think it maybe I could have put it. Oh wow!
Glass is always a little better than plastic. Yeah, so this is their evaporator. It's really pretty impressive. I've never operated it. But they've got all kind of fancy gadgets. Like this is an auto draw off that detects the sugar content. And as soon as it reaches a certain sugar content, it drops out the syrup. And then as it's drawing in fresh sap, that number will go back down and it'll lock it closed again, which is pretty cool.
You never mentioned Canada.
Oh,
Crop mixture up there, are they doing research?
so, I mean, yeah, we've partnered with I forget the name of the tribe. There's a tribe up in Vancouver Island that's making big leaf maple syrup. They've been doing it for a long time. Believe Gold or something like that. Kihu. Anyway, they've been doing that for a while, and in Vancouver or that area somewhere, they have an annual big leaf maple syrup festival. So they were actually kind of coming online a little before we were. That festival had been going on for a few years, but we're kind of all at the same level, and we have an annual conference, and we bring them in. Big tooth maple. Yeah, that's it's like a high elevation maple species that's pretty common in like Utah, maybe a little bit of Montana, Colorado. I've never actually seen it. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I'm not sure. There was a couple there that came to one of our conferences, and the first year they had like 10 taps. The next year they came back, they had 400 taps. They had a whole commercial operation. They were doing, a big festival every year. I mean, they just really blew it up. It was really cool.
Very cool.
Yeah, this is I'm taking coffee and molasses and so
It's a little sour too. Oh,
Thank you.
yeah, of course. I got another one here if anybody wants them. Do we have a trash can for the? Oh, okay, good. Oh, I'm right in front of the. What's that? Yeah, this is where I wonder, do you know, Robert, are they selling? Yeah, I don't either. They are commercially licensed. This is a certified kitchen. So they can sell. I've just been kind of waiting for the marketing to.
I think it's a quantity thing.
Yeah.
They don't have it consistently. They haven't necessarily sought it out to like, hey, come buy our thing. It's just like, hey, if you want to buy it, I got it.
And last year they had a really rough year, I understand. And there was some turnover. So.
Gonna be selling happening goods. Is that you personally or like?
Yeah, I would like to do it as a part of workshops. I'm still kind of figuring it out, but essentially it'd be if you see that bag of drop lines over there, it'll be taps and a little bit of tubing to be able to run it to a bucket. Yeah. Or it could buy the bucket too. I don't know. I haven't figured that out yet. But I mean, if you're interested, I can let you know. Yeah, I didn't talk about this, but I just got a specialty crop block grant to keep this work going, and it'll start next week essentially. But that also includes technical assistance to people that are trying to do commercial operations. So I can go out with them and maybe help them set up lines and do that kind of work. But it's really geared towards people that are interested in commercial. So if you meet those folks, send them my way. Mm-hmm. Yeah. A lot of people are going to want to try the hot, and I'm happy. And I'm planning on doing a couple workshops this year, which usually attracts the hobbyists. But like one or two of those people always end up going and spending a bunch of money. And so. Well, I do operate a listserv, and that's probably the best way. I will give you a business card with my email, or if my email's on, I don't know if it's on the thing, but that's the best way. I don't have like a website where people can sign up for the listserv, but I will give you my email. Don't let me go before I give you a business card, and I can get you on the listserv.
The other question is, if I did start doing this as a hobby and I had a course and I wanted to sell some at my farmer's market, what kind of certification do you have?
Yeah. Well, that is the big thing right now. So Washington is currently the only state in the US that does not have a cottage food exemption for big leaf maple or for maple syrup. So in any state that has maple sugaring has a cottage food exemption, just honoring the fact that we're boiling, like it's just a very safe food product, right? Yeah, so like people that do jams and jellies, they can make a certain amount of that product and sell a certain amount without getting like a certified kitchen and going through that whole process. So basically making it in their home. And like they can sell up to $35,000 a year worth of products. Yeah, no, it's a great way for people to get started, but we can't do it in maple syrup with it yet. I'm working on it. Oregon just made a cottage food exemption for it, and like almost overnight they had like 20 new producers. So it really is a huge barrier, and I don't know. I mean, it takes legislative action essentially. Which
So when you get the bill out there, send it out to the network, they will be all set.
exactly, and I'm very limited as like a state employee. I'm very limited in what I can do in terms of like legislative influence. I can inform, but it really takes the producers to push that through. And we have a maple syrup producer association right now that's just getting started. That will hopefully do that kind of work. Oh yeah, absolutely. And Washington Farm Forestry Association, I don't know if you're familiar with them, but they do a lot of that kind of work, and we're hoping they can help with that.
So legitimately, how many taps would you need to make it balance?
Oh, I mean,
obviously depends on size
and the sap run too, right? Like, so on a really good sap,
consolidate it down, like make a gallon of syrup.
so if you're just doing a bucket and you're not getting any sort of like anything to help improve that sap flow, you might get a gallon or two a day on a really good sap flow of sap. And so you might have a sap run that runs 3 or 4 days. Let's say you get 8 gallons from a tap. So if you have 10 taps, you end up with somewhere close to a gallon. There's losses, right? No, I would produce a gallon. If you get up to 90, no, 10 taps.
I mean, it's been different days. You said that you're happy, right?
Yeah, no, so it's kind of, we talk about it in terms of sap runs. You have different sap run or sap events, right? So if you have a good sap event on a bucket and bag system, the sap flow might go for like 3 days, and you might get somewhere between 1 and 2 gallons a day for a while, and then it might peter out to like half a gallon a day or something like that. So if you're collecting that off of 10 taps in one sap event, you might get enough for a gallon. But what I recommend people that are, doing this, they can freeze it, they can run it through a nano RO system, and then suddenly now it all fits into 1 5-gallon bucket, and then. So it's pushing water through these membranes that I don't really know all that much about. But essentially the water goes through, but the sugar does not. So every time you push it through, it's concentrating the sugar in that by 2. So you put the sap in, and it has 2 outflows. One is pure water, one is sap that's been concentrated twice, essentially. Yeah.
It is new.
Yeah, like how many yards, miles of tapping they have here, and as far as.
Oh, and here, gosh, I mean.
The bacteria on top of it kind of thing.
1,000, maybe 2,000, I don't know, something like that. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I don't know how many taps they have here, but I have 200 taps, and I would, and on 8 lines, and each line is at least 300 feet. So, yeah.
I'm an alum at Yale Forestry School,
Mhm.
and up at Yale Myers, northeastern Connecticut.
Oh.
I was there a couple of years ago, and I had a similar discussion about that. I saw all their bios.
Oh, nice, yeah.
But they have a little sugar shack, and I'm sure they're doing some research.
Yeah.
There, I don't know if there's, collaborative work going on.
And where was that again?
Yale Myers.
Oh, yeah, oh,
Yale
yeah.
Myers.
Sure, yeah, wow. Oh, you're a Yale alum? Wow. No? Wow. Wow, oh, that's so cool.
Yeah, that was. And anyway, they do a lot of active research. It's similar to school parks.
Yeah, that's
And
awesome.
there's,
Cornell has been generally,
well, Cornell school was even.
Yeah.
Syracuse school was originally older.
it's funny with the East Coast producers, they're generally very supportive. A lot of them don't like our syrup. Really, Mike Farrell, who's the former head of the Cornell Maple program, is the person that he got UW on board to apply for that grant. I mean, he's been the one that pushed this. He is the third biggest producer of maple syrup in the country right now, and he says that Bigleaf maple or the Pacific Northwest is the place to invest in maple syrup right now because of that high price point. So, you know, from that perspective, we have gotten some support from the East Coast, but at the same time, we're using a lot of the grant funds that usually are. And they've not been terribly pleased about that, so much so that they've actually changed the language in the grant funds so that it favors sugar maple over Bigleaf maple, which is unfortunate, but I know OSU still got one of those grants, so it's great.
Would you sign off?
Thank you so
Turn
much.
this off?
Oh yeah, how do I just,
Just say goodbye.
oh yeah, I didn't realize people were still listening. Bye, everybody. If you have questions, patrick.schultz@wsu.edu.